Luckily, the wolf was a lethal and ferocious being even without Sunny's direct control. In fact, if Sunny attempted to issue the sacred shade commands to tell it how to fight, he would only be getting in the way. The wolf had more battle experience than he did, was a better hunter than he was, and understood its own capabilities better than Sunny could ever hope to understand them. The Archon was too fast, too strong, and too beyond the scope of normal understanding for Sunny to be in his element while fighting it anyway. The laws of existence were bending and twisting around the deathless spirit, rejecting the very notion of common logic. Time, space, and even causality had become unreliable at best, making the Archon immensely deadly and unpredictable. One moment, he was taking an unhurried step. A split second later, he was already upon the wolf, raising his terrifying staff to crush the sacred beast beneath it. At times, his blows arrived before they were delivered. Time itself hastened or slowed down, or even seemed to flow in reverse on occasion. Sunny was rattled. Luckily, the wolf was not. It did not try to understand or predict the Archon and the results of his actions. Instead, it acted on pure instinct, reacting faster than Sunny could even realize what was happening. At the same time, the wolf was calculating and cunning, steadily evading the deathless spirit while never letting him get distracted and turn his attention to the distant Shadow Legion. With Sunny's augmentation and assistance, the shadow of the wolf was putting up an admirable fight against the Archon. It was so fearless and ferocious, in fact, that Sunny imagined that if it had been any other cursed or sacred beast, they would have stood a good chance of defeating it. The wolf would have long torn the creature's throat open and feasted on its flesh. However, the sacred being they faced today was deathless, and so, no matter how ferocious and fearsome the wolf was, all it could do was endure as its body was slowly being broken and mutilated. And Sunny, meanwhile, endured his soul being torn to shreds. Arg! The weaver's needle trembled in his fingers. He was not in good shape. None of his cores had crumbled yet, but they were all full of cracks, almost on the verge of being broken. The silent waters of his soul sea were undulating restlessly, while the replicas of the two citadels he controlled were quaking, fissures slowly climbing up their walls. It hurt like hell, of course. Just need to hold on, a little more. The Shadow Legion was far in the distance by then, almost gone behind the horizon. Nef's fierce flames, which had illuminated the entire desert, were now a distant halo. The dawn was not yet near, but Sunny figured that he was perhaps halfway there. He had really managed to buy a lot of time, but sadly not enough of it, and he did not think that he could endure 10 more minutes, let alone a few more hours. Not without losing a few of his cores, at least, and therefore a few of his shadows. Who would it be? The youngest of the 7, Lazy? Or maybe their eldest, gloomy sibling? Or perhaps both and more? Sunny gritted his teeth. Like hell. The weave was slowly taking shape beneath his needle. Torturously slowly, compared to how familiar it was. It was funny, really. Usually, Sunny did not even pay attention to this part of the weaving process. He wove the rudimentary patterns almost unconsciously, relying on experience and muscle memory. But now this simple weave seemed as difficult and impossible to master as it had once, a long time ago, when he attempted sorcery for the first time. Back then, he was in a cage in the Red Colosseum, waiting for an overwhelmingly, terrifyingly powerful adversary, an ascended zealot, to come and kill him. Now he was in literal hell, fighting a fallen god. Sunny wasn't sure if one could call that a successful career. Get in shape, damn it! The wolf, and Sunny's soul, endured another blow. The giant beast fell to the sand, gray smoker pouring like a waterfall from its maw, while Sunny's hand trembled. As a result, the pattern he had almost completed came close to coming undone. Snarling, he ducked to let a piece of shrapnel moving at supersonic speed flash just above his head and grabbed the unraveling threads with one of his hands. If not for the flesh weave, he would have lost his fingers right there and then. But luckily, his body had been altered to excel at weaving, as were his spirit, mind, and soul for that matter. So, Sunny managed to keep the pattern together. It was almost finished by then, requiring only the smallest touches. Catching Weaver's needle with his teeth, Sunny used all 6 of his hands to finish the pattern, and even though his very being was swaying and reeling from the pressure of having to battle a sacred being's will, he finally managed to complete the familiar spell weave. Sunny let out a tired sigh, holding the radiant soul shard in his fist. Then, he turned to look at the towering figure of the Archon. Great! Now, the worst part. He had to embed the soul shard and the spell weave anchored to it into the deathless spirit. How was he supposed to do that? The wolf had barely managed to rise when another devastating blow threw it to the ground once more. Sonny felt his vision darkening and swayed, failing to suppress a tortured groan from escaping his lips. Damn it, crap, curse it all! He straightened with another groan and turned to look in the direction of the tomb of Ariel. The Shadow Legion had finally disappeared behind the horizon, and Neff's radiance was like a distant, pale line above it. Sonny was surrounded by darkness. He inhaled deeply. Fine then. Let's do it. No point in dilly-dallying. With that, he looked at the Archon once more and stepped into the shadows. When Sonny emerged from them, he was standing directly on the shoulder of the deathless spirit. He was quite high above the desert, and the howling winds immediately crashed into him, straining to throw him down. The ivory fabric of the Archon's tattered robe was like a soft carpet beneath his feet. The ancient horror's skull was like a hill in front of him, and the golden crown set into the black bone was like a tall ridge. Naturally, only a complete fool would climb the body of a malevolent god. Standing on the shoulder of the Archon, Sonny was more or less surrendering himself to death. He could be squashed into a bloody puddle in an instant, or killed in a million other ways. The black skull turned slowly, two huge discs of gold staring at him like eyes. From that distance, Sonny could vaguely see the images etched into them, but because of the eerie radiance spilling from within the Archon's skull, he couldn't quite make out what those images showed. He wasn't sure that it would be wise to see them. The Archon's terrifying gaze descended upon him like an avalanche, making every wound on his body scream in pain, and every crack on his battered soul widened a little. Sonny forced out a smile. Hey bastard, what gave you the courage to bully my wolf? The Archon stared at him silently, his dislocated jaw hanging in a twisted grin. Then he slowly raised a hand, as if intending to squish Sonny like an annoying fly. Sonny lunged forward, rushing toward the base of the deathless spirit's spine. Far below, the wolf growled and leaped into the air, abandoning caution to weigh the fallen deity's arm down. It was sent crashing into the ground by an inexplicable blow that came before the Archon moved his skeleton hand to deliver it, slowly crumbling into a torrent of shadows, but that bought Sonny time. As his 6 shadows appeared on the white sand, having been robbed of the shade they had been augmenting, he reached the spine of the deathless spirit and thrust the soul shard at it, through it. And then, he did what he usually did when turning objects into memories. Using Weaver's needle, he attached the pattern to the unseen layer of the Archon's being, therefore connecting the two together. Bonding them. Did it work? The skeletal hand was already barreling toward him, obscuring the sky. At that moment, Sonny heard a voice. His own voice. It was the handy bracelet speaking. You have received a memory. Sonny was at best a heartbeat away from being destroyed. Dismiss. He was so panicked that he shouted the mental command out loud. In the next second, Sonny fell into a hurricane of white sparks, plummeting toward the white dunes. The shoulder of the deathless spirit, which had supported his weight, was not there anymore. Instead, a vast storm of essence sparks was pouring into his mangled soul. Sonny fell through the hurricane of ethereal sparks and hit the sand with enough force to send a cloud of it into the air. The resounding thump of his landing was quite jarring, but he was not in the state to pay it any attention. Ouch! He rolled onto his back with a groan. Above him, the blinding storm of essence sparks was obscuring the world. The sparks flowed in powerful torrents, twisting as they plummeted down toward him. Into him, the colossal whirlwind of essence was entering his soul, and all he could do was stare at it in a daze. He had actually succeeded. I can't believe that it actually worked. Sonny drew a shaky, hoarse breath. Then he exhaled slowly. But it did. It really had. Back there in the heat of the moment, Sonny had been desperate and daring enough to believe that it would, and because he needed it to, he unleashed his will to make sure that it did. It seemed that his insane idea had already been in accordance with the laws of existence, or at least close enough to how they were supposed to work for his supreme will to make up for the difference. And now, he had a deathless spirit as a memory, safely stored in his soul sea. Well, the safely part still remained to be seen. Sonny could not do anything with that memory, but the mere fact that the Archon had been memorized meant that he wasn't here anymore, and that was already a life-saving boon. Not only did it mean that Sonny did not have to have his soul cores shattered, but the will of the deathless spirit was not affecting this corner of the hell of Ariel anymore, which meant that Nephites and the Shadow Legion would have an easier time battling the undead horde. And speaking of the undead horde, the vast storm of essence sparks was finally beginning to thin out, most of it having already rushed into Sonny's chest. He could finally see what was happening around him, and what he saw made him let out a stifled curse. The battle was not over with the disappearance of the Archon. It was merely returning to being simply terrifying again, as opposed to completely unreasonable. The wolf had been vanquished back to his soul, so Sunny was alone, surrounded by countless deathless. They had stayed away during his battle against the Archon, but now, the undead warriors of Ariel's hell were starting to pay him attention again. His other 6 incarnations had crumbled. Sunny had been so out of his mind due to the pain and the sheer lunacy of what he was attempting to do that he failed to maintain his avatars, so they reverted to being simple shadows once more. Now these shadows gathered around him, looking at his battered figure with concern. They did not look that well either. Each had been born from and innately connected to one of his cores, after all, so they had come very close to becoming homeless, and most likely to being destroyed. Sunny forced out a weak smile. "What are you looking at, fools?" The shadows glanced at each other. The happy shadow was just happy to be alive. The creepy shadow seemed fascinated by the idea of collecting malevolent undead as trophies. The haughty shadow could not believe that Sunny was so pathetic as to get them in that state, while the naughty shadow did not even care, staring in the direction where Nephice and the Shadow Legion had gone instead. The crazy shadow was mad. The lazy shadow could not be bothered to show a reaction, seemingly bored. As for the original invaluable helper, the gloomy shadow, it did not get a say because Sunny was currently using it to manifest himself. He could just imagine the exasperated eye-roll, though. Maybe a slow, mocking round of applause. He sighed and slowly got to his feet. "Come, help me up." The shadows wrapped themselves around him, and he instantly felt better, stronger. Sunny had little time before the deathless descended upon him like an avalanche, so he briefly assessed his state. It was, in one word, terrible. His soul sustained so much damage that it would have long collapsed if not for soul weave. His cores were covered in cracks. His soul sea was turbulent and restless, and there, high above, an enormous sphere of light was orbiting the 7 battered black suns. That was the Archon, or at least a disassembled version of him. When Sunny stared at the radiant sphere, he felt a chill run down his spine. He did not sense any kind of consciousness or will in the memory, but it did have a presence, and that presence was full of malice. As he watched, a small spark of light separated itself from the sphere and drifted upward, dissipating after a few moments. Sunny shuddered. The memory of Archon wanted to be summoned, it seemed. Of course, Sunny had no intention of doing that. If he had a choice in the matter, the damn thing would never see the light of day again. But at the same time, it felt like there was now a ticking time bomb in his soul. Who knew when that bomb was going to go off? "I'll probably have to travel to Shadow Realm, summon the bastard there, and run away as fast as I can." But for now, he needed to run away as fast as he could from other deathless, not the sacred horror he had imprisoned in his soul. Sunny grimaced from the appalling pain that permeated his entire being and glanced at the undead warriors, who were already rushing at him like a tide. Then he took a step back and turned into a shadow, fleeing across the dunes from the deathless horde. He was a decent enough fighter and a proficient sorcerer, but if there was one thing Sunny was really good at, it was running away. He caught up with Nephice and Azarax just before dawn. As the sun rose above Ariel's hell, the deathless stopped their relentless onslaught and retreated, burrowing into sand. The undead following Azarax did as well. The battered soldiers of the Shadow Legion were motionless, standing among the dunes in eerie silence. Sunny rose from the shadows and walked the rest of the distance in the pale radiance of early dawn. He looked around, searching for his shadows. Saint's armor was dented and broken, her jade skin visible through the breaches. Slayer was nursing a few wounds of her own, even if her countenance was as cold and menacing as ever. Serpent had coiled itself and hid its head, towering above the desert like a mountain of onyx scales. Sunny saw Azarax as well. The ancient tyrant was sitting on the ground with his head lowered. As rays of sunlight fell on his mighty form, he moved slightly and burrowed his hand into the sand, staring at it absent-mindedly in subdued silence. Finally, Sunny's gaze fell on Nephice. She had regained her human form and was now sitting on the sand, watching the sun rise. Her face was calm and devoid of all emotions, her humanity having been burned away by the ferocious white flames. This was the first time Nephice had fully unleashed her aspect after losing the connection to most of the longing domain, so Sunny was a little concerned about her. Groaning and grimacing, he limped toward Nephice and sat down nearby. "Are you all right?" She turned her head and studied him silently, then gave him an indifferent nod. Raising her hands, Nephi pulled Sunny to lie on her lap and placed them on his chest. Her skin ignited with a soft radiance, and he felt her flames seep into his soul, mending it and washing away the pain. Sunny let out a relieved sigh. Ah! He was dead tired, and the soothing warmth made him feel sleepy. As he lay there, his head resting comfortably on Neff's lap, an annoying shadow fell on him. Opening his eyes, Sunny saw Azarax staring down at him with a grin. Well, that grin of his was eternal, and he could not get rid of it even if he wanted to. So Sunny could not blame him for it. The ancient tyrant scoffed. Well, well, you really did survive a battle with the Archon, Shadow. Good job distracting him, and managing to escape him as well. Sunny blinked slowly. Huh? Who said that I escaped from the Archon? Azarax tilted his skull. Would you be alive now otherwise? Tired and embraced by a blissful warmth, Sunny smiled lazily. No, I mean, I did not have to escape, because I wiped that thing out. There's no trace of it left in this desert anymore. Not even a single bone. The Archon only exists as a memory now, so I suggest you forget about him. Azarax stared at him darkly. That can't be true. Sunny chuckled. Why? I didn't even need a weapon to deal with that guy. I did him in with a needle. In fact, I just told him something like, "You're dismissed." And poof, he exploded. Azarax scoffed. You're lying. Sunny simply shrugged. Nephi, meanwhile, brushed the hair away from his face and smiled faintly. He never lies. Her voice was calm and even. Azarax stared at them for a while, then shook his skull and walked away with angry steps. The sun was rising above Ariel's hell. A new day was beginning. The tomb of Ariel looked closer than it had ever before, but also insurmountably distant. Rain walked across the ashen soil of the Ebony Island. It was strange. The island looked very much like the Ivory Island, but was also completely different. There was no emerald grass, no clear lake, no grove of ancient trees, and no bones of a dead dragon either. Instead, there were ruins of mysterious structures buried in the ash, dark stone, and obsidian berths protruding into the chasm that separated the island from the rest of the chained isles. The pagoda itself was entirely black, as opposed to the pristine white of the ivory tower. In fact, it was so lusterless and black that its walls seemed to devour light, like a vertical rift in the fabric of the world. The 7 broken heavenly chains hanging from the stone slopes of the ivory island were nowhere to be seen, either. Instead, there were other chains, just as enormous and mighty, but new and shiny as opposed to ancient and weathered. These chains were quite mundane, and had been forged in the subterranean smelting plants of NQSC. Then, they were delivered to the chained isles through a dream gate, and used to connect the Ebony Tower to the rest of the flying islands, in order to prevent them from gradually collapsing into the sky below. Now, the enormous alloy chains stretched over the vast chasm at the heart of the chained isles, drawn taut. The Ebony Island served as the nexus of the entire region, holding it up in the sky. Quite impressive. Rain could only vaguely imagine the amount of ingenuity, industrial might, and complex calculations that had gone into pulling the Ebony Island from beneath the sea of divine flames in the depths of the sky below, then turning it into the anchor of this fractured continent. It definitely took the efforts of numerous people, including a few saints and a supreme, to accomplish, and a bit of divine sorcery of the demon of destiny as well. Humans might not have understood how it worked, but they seamlessly integrated it into their design nevertheless. The result looked no less magnificent and humbling than all the other impossible sights one could find in the dream realm, more so even considering what it represented. A flawless synthesis of ancient sorcery and modern engineering, as well as a brilliant example of what was possible when all kinds of different people, mundane and awakened, worked together to achieve a benign and constructive goal. It was an example of how the world was meant to be, but very rarely was. Rain, focus. Rain flinched and turned her gaze back to where Cassie was kneeling on the ground, painting runes on the stone surface of the Ebony Island with a brush. Sorry. She was here to serve as Cassie's eyes, so there was no time to gawk at the sights. With Rain focused on the runes, Cassie was able to continue. As her brush glided gracefully across the black stone, she spoke in a measured tone. This rune doesn't have a meaning, but it expresses denial or prohibition. Adding it to a phrase changes the meaning, while adding it to a word often creates an antonym, but not always. Synonyms and antonyms are a separate topic, so we will not get into them right now. Which was probably wise, because it was a topic completely alien to Rain. At the moment, Cassie was creating a defensive array to protect the Ebony Island from the siege she believed was inevitable, similar to those she and Sunny had created before to reinforce a few other citadels, but also different, since she could not rely on his expertise anymore. Rain and Cassie had been at it for several days already, and since Rain had nothing to do but stare in the right direction, Cassie decided to give her lessons on runic sorcery as she worked. Rain was soaking the knowledge like a sponge. There was a lot of overlap between shaping and runic sorcery. After all, the latter was based on the former. However, there were also enough differences to make the two completely different from each other. There were no synonyms in shaping, for example. Everything only had one name, and every name was absolute. So, there could be no names that had the same meaning. There were more differences than that, of course. In shaping, there were only the names and their medium, the shaper. Runic sorcery, on the other hand, involved much more. There were the runes themselves, which transcribed the names, and the sorcerer who drew them. There was the canvas on which the runes were drawn, the tool used to draw them, and even the medium that transferred the runes from the brush to the canvas, unless they were carved, in which case there wasn't. The runes themselves were far more complex than the names, too, and there was an art to expressing the names through either solitary runes or combinations of them. Not everyone could fathom the names, but everyone could learn the runes and transcribe an approximation of a name they were not equipped to know. It was like an entirely new universe, but since Rain was a gifted shaper, she took to the runic sorcery easily as well. It was actually far more fun than learning the names. Cassie was still talking. This rune describes space. However, there are countless runes that describe space in the runic language, all bearing a slightly different meaning. So, if you want to transcribe the true name of space, you need to list them all in order, if you aspire to achieve a good result, that is. Rain studied the stunning weave of runes for a few moments, then tilted her head. But what does that element of the array do? Cassie smiled faintly. Do you still have that scarf of yours? In case of emergency? She could see Rain's own runes, so she probably knew. So, she was only asking for the sake of being polite. After spending time with Cassie, Rain realized that the blind seer did a lot of things simply to make people feel comfortable in her presence. It was a habit born of necessity, both because of her disability and because people would have found it odd and disturbing to be around an oracle as powerful as she was otherwise. Rain raised a hand and touched the silk scarf wrapped around her neck and shoulders. Sure, I do. Cassie nodded. This is what I am trying to do. Sunny designed it to lock you in space in case the cloud veil above Godgrave broke unexpectedly. Actually, he used the same kind of enchantment later to defeat a cursed beast, Abundance. And now I am trying to create a derivative runic enchantment that accomplishes the same thing. Rain frowned. You are trying to lock the ebony tower in space? Continuing to draw runes while pouring essence into the brush, Cassie shook her head. No, I am trying to lock space around the ebony tower. She sighed and turned slightly, facing the vast chasm. Mordred is putting on a brave face, but the Dreamspawn will push him back against the hollow mountains eventually. The mirror domain is simply not powerful enough to contend against the entirety of the human domain. Perhaps it would have been if given more time, but Mordred had attained supremacy less than a year ago. His domain is too young. Cassie shook her head. The war will arrive here eventually. This is where Mordred will make his last stand. And you remember why we had to run away from the Ivory Island, don't you? Rain nodded. Because of the Night Garden. Cassie smiled. No, not because of the Night Garden. It is because of the man commanding the Night Garden. His aspect allows him to manipulate space, so he is a walking nightmare for anyone planning to fight a defensive battle. She returned to drawing runes. The Ebony Island is a natural fortress because it is surrounded by a vast abyss. If Nightwalker is allowed to twist the space around it however he wishes, that advantage will be gone. So, naturally, one of the functions of the defensive array I am creating is to reinforce space here and make it less malleable. Now focus. This rune. Rain looked at the expanse of black stone where Cassie was drawing the runes and concentrated on listening. In the process, however, she couldn't help but look at Cassie herself. Her chest tightened. Cassie did not look that well. She seemed to have lost weight, and her skin was unhealthily pale. Worst of all, the left side of her blindfold was soaked in blood once again, red drops rolling down her cheek from time to time. She looked fragile. Rain gritted her teeth. It was all because of that man Mordred. Every morning, Cassie entered his quarters, where she cleansed his memories of the plague. And every morning, she left with blood on her face, weaker than she had been the day before. It was because of the strain of using her transcendent ability despite missing an eye. But more than that, it was because of the strain of experiencing the memories of a sovereign. The Supremes were more than just humans, after all, and their minds were too vast for mortal people to fathom. And from what Rain was able to find out, Mordred of Nowhere was the most inhuman of the Supremes. Nephice felt the desire of countless people. Sunny shared his senses with his shades. The Dreamspawn was connected to his thralls somehow, as well, sharing in their thoughts and emotions. But the King of Nothing was different. He simply existed shattered across millions of vessels, each vessel representing an instance of his inhuman mind. So that was what Cassie experienced every time she delved into his memories. She experienced being millions of beings at the same time. Needless to say, that demented kaleidoscope of perspectives put a tremendous burden on her own mind, which, albeit transcendent, was still human. And speaking of inhuman, Rain furtively looked up. Cassie was not the only one preparing the Ebony Island for a siege. The King of Nothing was preparing too. Only unlike Cassie, he wasn't drawing runes on the black stone. Instead, he was simply bringing some of his vessels to the Ebony Island. Looking at them, Rain could not help but feel her stomach churn. Creepy, creepy, creepy. Mordred of Nowhere seemed like the most inhuman of the sovereigns for more than one reason. It was not just that his soul was split among millions of vessels. It was also that most of those vessels were not human. Instead, they were nightmare creatures. The chained island bordered the Hollow Mountains in the north and the Glass Hell in the west, so it was an important confluence point for the King of Nothing. It was also a gate leading south, across the regions of the Dream Realm conquered by the King of Swords decades ago, and over the Black Mountains, where the heartland of the Dream Realm lay. So there was always a constant procession of ghastly abominations passing through the Ebony Island. Some came from the Hollow Mountains, while some came from Godgrave. The latter especially gave Rain chills, because she still vividly remembered watching too many of her comrades being torn apart and devoured by the hideous creatures of the Scarlet Jungle. The nightmarish vessels of the King of Nothing came to Chained Island through one of the mirror gates and left through another, traveling toward the Black Mountains, where a fierce battle was raging across countless peaks. They had rarely lingered before, but now things were different. As Rain watched, a colossal abomination that resembled a hideous tick dragged its swollen belly across the ash, numerous revolting shapes moving beneath its gray skin in a nauseating pattern. Reaching the edge of the island, it turned to face the Ebony Tower and fell to the ground heavily, burrowing all 8 of its segmented legs deep into the obsidian bedrock. A swarm of eerie, transparent abominations. Rain recognized them as the crystalline insects from the Glass Hell, followed, carrying heavy plates of forged metal. Moving with flawless precision, they began constructing an iron cradle around the gargantuan tick, as if wanting to protect it from threats coming from neighboring islands. Looking at it, Rain couldn't help but feel like she was watching a squad of army engineers build fortifications around a fixed artillery position. On the other side of the island, something that looked like a hill of long black hair was laying on the ground. There was a ghastly abomination hidden under the mountains of black hair, though, a thing that looked like a hybrid between a spider and an ape, its long limbs ending with enormous hands. A crowd of mundane humans was dismantling an ancient ruin near the monstrosity, all wearing the same absent expression. Dozens of them strained to move each enormous block of obsidian, piling them near the abomination. To Rain, it looked like soldiers preparing projectile ammunition for an enormous trebuchet. Some distance away, a swarm of nightmare creatures that resembled crystal wasps was spilling over the edge of the island like a glass river. They crawled down its inverted slopes and hid on its dark side, far away from where anyone could see them. They were stealth aircraft deploying to protect the island from aerial attacks from the sky below. Somewhere else, a dozen horned beasts were pulling a massive shape covered in black fabric across the obsidian. Rain was almost sure that it was meant to serve as an air defense battery. Things like that were happening all across the Ebony Island. In a few areas, groups of small abominations were planting scarlet seeds into the ash. The same was happening on all islands surrounding the Ebony Tower. Crazy bastard. Is he creating minefields out of the Scarlet Jungle? Rain was suddenly covered in cold sweat. That loathsome jungle was only contained by the incinerating skies above Godgrave. What was going to happen if someone brought it away from that white abyss? Would it consume all of the Dream Realm like an unstoppable tide? She shivered. Well, probably not. After all, the Scarlet Jungle had existed for thousands of years, but never moved past the arm bones of the dead god. So perhaps the king of nothing knew what he was doing, after all. Rain. Stop staring at those things. Rain flinched again and hurriedly looked back at the runes. She hesitated for a few moments, and then sighed. The one in the basement is nice. The other one, though, is a bit of a horror show. Cassie smiled. He can hear you, you know. Rain coughed, then shrugged nonchalantly. Well, if he has manners, he'll pretend that he didn't. Cassie shook her head slightly and focused on drawing the runes. After a while, though, she said quietly, "It was north of here many years ago, when I first met Mordred." Her hand grew still, and she turned her head to face north, as if trying to see something in the distance. Now that was a horror show. It all ended with a battle between two saints. One of them died, and as a result of their clash, an entire island was destroyed. That is why there is only one citadel on the Chained Isles now, not two. With that, Cassie continued working on the defensive array and said somberly, "I wonder what will happen when two supremes clash here instead." Rain did not know how to answer. At the same time, inside the ebony tower, Mordred was leaning on a wall with his eyes closed. He was breaking the blockade on the River of Tears. At the same time, he was encircling Ravenheart. At the same time, he was battling vicious predators in Godgrave. At the same time, he was invading the Great Hive under the Glass Hell. At the same time, he was waging war on humanity in the Black Mountains. And much more. He was watching Song of the Fallen and the Princess of Shadows, too. Well, if he has manners, he'll pretend that he didn't. Still keeping his eyes closed, Mordred smiled. Cheeky girl. Finally opening them, he looked at the divine flames burning in the great brazier at the center of the dark hall. The white flames reflected in his mirror-like eyes, and for a few moments, it was as if white sparks were dancing in them. With a sigh, Mordred looked away from the flame and descended the stairs to the ground floor of the ebony tower. Then he descended deeper underground. Walking to the large mirror standing in the circular chamber, he looked at the reflection of himself sitting there on the floor. Mordred studied his other self for a while and then smiled. "Made a little friend, did you?" After a short pause, the part of him that was imprisoned in the mirror smiled. "I did. Then again, I doubt I would have been able to befriend anyone unless you allowed it. So thank you, brother." Mordred scoffed. "It's just that I know how boring it is, being trapped in a mirror. You at least got a whole miniature realm to enjoy and explore, complete with windows to the outside world. All I'd gotten was a stone cell. Look, compared to our father, am I not generous? Am I not merciful?" The other part of him remained silent, then shrugged slightly. "I couldn't say. I never really had the opportunity to get to know him, after all. From what I hear, though, anyone would seem generous and merciful compared to our father." Mordred laughed. "That is true as well." Supreme Mordred stared at Saint Mordred, both of them reflecting in each other's eyes. One wore an expression of contempt, the other of wistful sympathy. One was the captor, and the other was the captive. Eventually the captor said, "But you don't seem to hold it against him, do you?" He lingered for a few moments, and then smiled bitterly. "You know, it's funny. What was it that she said? The one in the basement is nice, but the other one is a horror show. Of the two of us, you are the one people tend to perceive as the better version. But they all fail to realize that even if I am not nice, you are the real horror show between us." Mordred leaned forward, almost pressing his forehead against the mirror. "I might not be entirely human, but you are barely a human at best. You lack so much. You can't feel anything, not resentment, not anger, not hatred. Not the feeling of being hurt, not the feeling of being betrayed. Not even the painful shame of being discarded. Which one of us deserves to be called the king of nothing, really?" He shook his head. "People don't seem to understand that a person who is a friend to everyone is loyal to no one. Your nice act is simply a facade that hides how crippled and inhuman you are. You smiled blissfully at that girl, the Princess of Shadows, but if the Dreamspawn was here killing her, you'd smile blissfully at him too." His reflection sighed. "You're probably right. But I like to think that I'd at least ask him to stop." Mordred looked at the reflection chillingly. "And yet if he refused to listen and tortured her to death, you wouldn't hold it against him. You wouldn't be capable of holding it against him. So how can they look at you and see someone nice?" He paused for a second and then smiled. "Maybe it's because you are so blank that all they can see in you is a reflection of themselves. No one really understands how empty you are, so they simply project their own image of what a human should be on you. And since people love nothing more than themselves, you receive their sympathy. Must be nice." Mordred took a step back and laughed. Well, it's not like I need anyone's sympathy. And it's not like I would feel the inclination to do something if that girl was being tortured and killed in front of me, either. So I guess neither of us has that good of a claim on being human. Which is just as well. Who would want to be human, anyway? He grinned. In truth, I am only keeping the girl alive for 2 reasons. One is to have her as hostage in case I need to force Song of the Fallen to do something she doesn't want to do, or deter her from doing something that I don't want her to do. The witch knows to be on her best behavior unless she wants to see her little friend tortured, broken, and killed. His grin dimmed a little. The other reason is insurance in case the Lord of Shadows does come back. Until the Dreamspawn is dealt with, it's best to have a cordial relationship with that man, and I don't think that he'll take the death of his prized pupil well. Having him throw a fit in the middle of a war against the Dreamspawn would be most problematic. The other Mordred studied the King of Nothing for a while, not saying anything. Eventually, though, he asked, "You don't usually feel the need to explain yourself to me. Why are you so talkative today, brother?" Mordred just stared at him, a subtle frown twisting his brow. "Yes, indeed. Why am I so talkative today?" His reflection sighed. "It's because you are nervous, isn't it?" "You are." Mordred smiled. "Why should I be nervous? I am having the time of my life. An all-consuming war against the entire world, with nothing impeding or constraining me. I am having a blast. You can't imagine how liberating it is, to finally be free of the need to pretend to be something I'm not. To be free of the need to reflect all those people back on themselves, so that they'd see me as one of their own." He chuckled. "You know, that thing that defined us and our entire despicable clan, the lineage of War God. I used to think that it was severely misunderstood. They went around giving us titles like the Prince of War, the Princess of War, the Sovereign of War. But War God was also the goddess of life, the deity of technology and progress. She was the patron deity of humanity as well." Mordred shook his head. "Our father and grandfather were praised and exalted as conquerors, as consummate warriors. But they were both craftsmen first and fighters second. They were artificers who wielded utility aspects. They created things. So, I always thought that focusing solely on the war aspect of War God was misguided." He looked around and grinned. "But now that I am waging absolute war against all of existence, I finally understand the allure. It feels natural to me. I like it. I am enjoying myself way more than I ever expected. I think it really is in our blood, war." Mordred looked at his counterpart and grimaced. Although someone as pathetic as you would never be able to understand it. The other Mordred studied him for a long while, contemplating something. Eventually, he asked quietly, "You don't think you can win, do you?" Mordred stared at his reflection for a few moments, expressionless. He scoffed. "What are you talking about? Of course, I can win. I will win. You just wait and see. At the end of all this, I'll be more vast and powerful than ever, while the Dreamspawn will be broken and defeated, sealed in some hellhole he will never be able to escape." His reflection shook his head. "No, you can't." The other Mordred looked up at his supreme self, seeing his own reflection in those mirror-like eyes. "You cannot defeat that man, brother. You know you can't. He made us, after all. Everything we are was molded in his image. He knows everything there is to know about us, while we only know what he decided to show us. He is older, stronger, more knowledgeable. He has all of humanity fighting on his side. He is everything. But what do we have? We only have ourselves. And that is not enough to defeat everything." Mordred just stared at him silently. After a short while, his reflection added, "So why are you persisting in this madness? This is not like you, brother. Trying to destroy all of humanity was already monstrous enough, misguided enough. But you were too late. Now it's too late. That man already made all of them conduits of his domain, so he is unstoppable now. You can't even steal people from his domain without becoming infected by the plague yourself. Don't you see that there is no way to win?" Mordred remained silent for a few moments, then smiled crookedly. "Who says that we only have ourselves?" He looked up, as if trying to pierce the obsidian walls of the ebony tower with his gaze. "I also have Song of the Fallen. She can cleanse my mind of the plague, which means that I still have a chance. Sure, the Dreamspawn cannot be destroyed as long as people remember him, but when there are no people, and I am the only one left, whose power will be greater? Whose will be more powerful? This war is far from being lost, brother. I'll find a way to win it. Wait and see." His other self slowly shook his head. "Lady Kasha might be powerful and talented, and her aspect might be exactly what you need to prolong this war. But she is merely a saint. How much of the plague can she erase from the mind of a supreme? Enough to add a few vessels to your domain each day? A few hundred? How are you going to subjugate millions of awakened and billions of mundane people before the dream spawn comes to take your head? He sighed. I just don't understand why you are preparing for the decisive battle here on the Chained Isles. Wasn't your plan to escape into the Hollow Mountains and lead a long guerrilla campaign against the Hunger Domain from the safety of the mist? What changed? The other Mordred lingered for a second, and then asked with a hint of concern in his voice. Are you sure that Lady Kasha only erased those of your memories that were the source of the plague? Mordred studied him silently for a while, then smiled. Yes, I am quite sure. Do you think that I am more trusting than you? Of course, I've set countermeasures in place before letting her anywhere near my mind. He inhaled deeply, then looked his reflection in the eye. Sure, that was the plan. However, that plan became meaningless the moment Changing Star and the Lord of Shadows chose to disappear instead of serving as a foil for the dream spawn, at least for a while. Everything happened too swift without them. Besides, he lingered for a moment, then looked away. You probably won't get it, but there comes a time when a man must take a stand. For me, that second is now. Mordred looked around the circular chamber, then faced the mirror once again. You know, the first time I fought Morgan, I was quite afraid. After all, she had always been a bit of a scarecrow in my mind. Someone who was more talented than me, more powerful than me, more favored than me. Someone who was more desirable than me, and for a good reason. A true heiress of war, forged into a perfect weapon by our father. He smiled bitterly. And indeed, when we finally crossed swords, I almost lost my life. I did lose a hand and an eye, actually. But in the end, I still won. I was able to win because I held nothing back, because unlike her, I didn't care about losing a hand and an eye, and more than that, I didn't care about staying alive. About staying free instead of ending up in another cage for countless years. All I cared about was winning that fight. His smile faded slowly, replaced by a cold, grim expression. So now that I am set to face the dream spawn in battle, to face my maker, how can I hope to win if I am holding something back? If I leave myself a path of retreat and plan for what happens if I lose, if I scheme to survive even if I am defeated, then I have already been defeated, don't you think? Mordred sighed and looked around, a pleasant smile finding its way back onto his lips. No, whatever happens, it will happen here on the Ebony Island. I am not running from this fight. I think it's quite fitting, actually, that everything will be decided on the Chained Isles. You wouldn't know, but I made a lot of memories here, a long time ago. Turning back to the mirror, he laughed. So I can't wait to make more. This time, they will be memories of war.